Shabbat Shalom. There is a very interesting midrash, a rabbinic story, one of my favorites, connected to this holiday, as you'll see, and to the very last days of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. And it was right at the very end of that whole siege, this whole period we're thinking about right now. The Romans have been encircling the city for almost a year. And the end was coming clearly. That long ago, the Zealots had burned all of the food that was in the city to force the other inhabitants to fight. And the Romans were nearly through, nearly able to break the siege. And so as the Midrash recounts, one rabbi who was a member of these new group of leaders among the Jewish people, a rabbi or a Pharisee, indifferent and in opposition to the Sadducees and to the temple priests, saw what was happening, the unfolding doom, and he created a plan. So as the Midrash says, he was smuggled out of the city in a coffin. And he didn't try and flee, but he went straight to the Roman general who was in charge of the siege. And he made a deal with the Roman, not to save Jerusalem, that was impossible, but to allow a few rabbis to survive in Yavne, a new center of learning. And this rabbi, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he asked for Yavne and its sages. And he was a realist. He knew that there was really only a small seed of hope of survival for Judaism at that point. And surprisingly, the Roman general agreed. He said, you can have Yavne and its sages, because his goal was much greater. He was destroying Jerusalem, the once great city, and the Second Temple that was one of the glories of the ancient world, and forcing a whole people and faith to submit to Rome. So he was not worried about Yavne and his few sages. But the rabbis of Yavne were the foundation of an incredible whale of creativity that began there and it continued, and of really determination, unlike what Jews had seen for millennia, so many new ideas and thoughts. I remember studying in rabbinical school about those years and how these remnants of the leaders of the Jewish people created the Mishnah and the Talmud, and it all started with them. And so the temple was destroyed, as we know, and the Jewish people sank to even greater depths when the Bar Kokhba revolt was repelled by the Romans and the people exiled from the land. And the rabbis too made mistakes, political mistakes and errors. But at the same time, there was this creativity, this new thoughts and new beginnings, and incredible stories in our scriptures of trying to live in a world without sacrifices, without a temple, which to them was just impossible to imagine. A rabbi who walked up and down the beach all day long trying to think, well, what blessing should be for this situation and what blessing for this situation. And then students and communities who were following this one rabbi's vision of how you do Havdalah. And then the other said, no, that's the wrong one. We're following this one. And they were making it up as they were going along. And it all really changed. And these sages of Yavne and their descendants went deep, deep, deep into the Torah and tried to understand how it applied to their incredibly new situation. And so without a temple, prayers and blessing became sacrifices, and people's very own home and their Shabbos table became like the altar in the temple. And communities became small and self-sufficient, not centralized around the big temple in Jerusalem. And Judaism was brought into homes, into communities, into the hearts of individual Jews. And these sages knew who they were and they knew who they were not. They knew they were not prophets. They knew they didn't hear God's words, but they deeply cared about the people they were serving, and they loved the Torah, and they were willing to do anything to help the Jewish people survive and keep moving forward. And so if they couldn't hear God's word, they said, well, we're going to debate until we know what we think God's word is. And we're going to argue And we're going to slowly move ahead, a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, and just try and figure out what are the values that we need to survive. And so those early debates became the Mishnah and then spread to Babylon and became the Talmud, and there was a Talmud in Jerusalem as well, or in Palestine at the time. And it continued until all of Jewish life was based on what these few sages had begun a long time ago. A whole culture developed and based on that political moderation, on debate and arguing, on modesty, on resilience and determination. And really, that was a Sinai moment. It may not have been as flashy as the original Sinai moment where the mountain was shaking and God spoke, but it was nearly as momentous and as important as that original Sinai moment. And while the Jews in the Torah were escaping Egypt, their bondage in Egypt, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he was escaping the glory of Jerusalem. But really, Jerusalem at that point had also sunken into corruption and misuse. And the way we interpret these different moments in our history, Sinai moments, and the moments of traveling through the wilderness and others, this is a foundational idea to how Jews understand the whole world, our lives, our history, our individual lives, our communal lives. And this is how we see history. There's redemption, then there's a Sinai moment where new ideas and new thoughts come flooding in and become the basis for the future and growth. And then there's often a wilderness that comes right after Sinai, just like the Jews who spent 40 years in the wilderness. And the wilderness lasts a very long time. In the wilderness, there's challenges, there's learning, there's growth and opportunities. And during that time, all those new ideas are slowly integrated and become part of the communal being. And the trials test ever more deeply how ingrained those ideas are. And the wilderness is a hard time, but it's also a blessed time when one feels close to our truest nature and to our Creator. And then finally, at the end of the wilderness, we enter the promised land and we harvest all the fruits of those long years, labors, joy. And we're settled and great building work starts. We created the temple in Jerusalem and once we entered the land. And the Bible came out of that period of settledness in the land. There were earlier stories, of course, but it all came together in the great flourishing of spiritual culture once the people were in the land. And prophets walk the land to try and bring out the most important forms and manifestations of those new ideas. But then one day, there comes a time when all the fruit is harvested and the trees have grown old, and it's time for another Sinai moment. And so the temples were destroyed, and yet the people no longer needed or wanted sacrifice. And Jerusalem was in ruins, but it was also ripe for the Jews to take everything they'd built and spread it throughout the world and to learn from all other peoples. And really that Sinai moment of the rabbis didn't last very long. There were a few hundred years where everything was being reworked and woven together, reinterpreted. We say Rabbi Akiva interpreted every crown on every letter of the Torah. And then over the hundreds of years later, it grew, it became expounded and larger. As it says in the Torah in our week's parasha, when Moses is recounting the journeys, the people are on Mount Sinai. At a certain point, God says to the people, you spent enough time on the mountain, now go out and start traveling. And so this is what happened too at the time of the rabbis. They had to leave the walls of the Beit Midrash and take it all throughout the world. This is the Judaism we're still living. So as been mentioned, Tisha B'Av is the holiday or the fast day really that's tonight. And not a major fast day for a long time. And probably not many of all of you marked Tisha B'Av in many years that came before. It just was not on the radar of the American Jewish community or for a long time for many reasons. One was we were back in Jerusalem, Israel is rebuilt. Why do we need to commemorate an ancient destruction? But yet, Tisha B'Av in the last few years in the Jewish world has taken on more energy and more importance. thousands sing at the Kotel every year. And there are some within the Jewish world who are saying, why is that? It's because Tisha B'Av is of all the Jewish days, is a holiday that teaches us the most about where we are right now in our history, about these movements, because we are the generation who are living between two great turns of the wheel. After the Sinai moment of the rabbis, then there was the wilderness, a very long wilderness, 2,000 years of wandering, of exile, of traveling. And then we experienced redemption. We entered the promised land and we found a flourishing diaspora here. And finally, if we look at our history over the last period, what we've been doing, we've been harvesting from all of our travels. And over the last century, not only are we back in our land, but also at the height of our intellectual and cultural contributions to the entire world in so many areas. The fruits of all those 2,000 years of our culture have borne amazing fruit in all of the ways that Jews have contributed to the world and leading in so many areas. The Jewish mind and Jewish altruism and service to humanity. Those are 2,000 years of debate, of education, of resilience, of determination, all coming to be harvested. And so despite all the issues of our times, it is a glorious time. It's a time of harvest, a time of settledness. And so on Tisha B'Av, we're marking where we are. We're also praying as we fast this weekend that it will even flourish more into even more newness and spiritual, religious renewal. And then perhaps it will be time for another Sinai moment, another time of finding new thoughts and new inspiration and new beginnings that will carry us even further into the next era of our history and of our timeless mission and journey. Shabbat Shalom.